Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at Clackamas County Business Alliance. We are very excited to bring a gentleman who almost needs no introduction anymore, Mr. John Horvick of DHM Research. He's going to talk to us about polling and some election information. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to John, but I just wanted to say thank you guys for joining us, and we look forward hopefully next month to being in person. So with that, John, it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, and there we go. All righty. Well, pleasure to be here with you today. This really is a fun time. Elections are exciting, particularly if you're in my line of work, but they're important for all of us, and I'm going to try to provide some context for what we're seeing with the public opinion research that we're doing. Going to talk state. We're going to talk some local stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about Portland, and I know you're all in Clackamas County, but the reason I'm going to talk about Portland is less about because you might be interested in how Portlanders are feeling, but because Portland is becoming central to the state's election, and I'll try to sort of describe the ways that that's happening in a bit. It's one of the issues, just like crime and homelessness are. Portland is an issue too. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about how people are feeling about the economy and taxes as well. So that's the drill. I can't see you. I think that Nellie is monitoring Q&A. I would say if there are questions along the way, particularly if I'm not being clear, if you don't understand what the heck I'm talking about, I'd rather try to answer those questions on the fly rather than you wondering. And then I'll do my best. Well, I will save time for Q&A at the end too. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great. Yeah, no, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen for any questions that you may have. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm really looking forward to learning about this unique 2022 election. So thanks, John.
All right, so we're going to dive in. I want to begin by talking sort of big picture Oregon mood, but I want to ground us first. Sometimes it's when you think about a current election or moment in time, it's helpful to have some reference point. What is it like in the past? Can we compare it to something? And if we have a good reference point, we might think, all right, is this more favorable to say the Democrats or more favorable to the Republicans relative to that reference point? So the numbers I want us to keep in mind are these. Then I'll explain them after I share what the numbers are. 1.4, 30-30, and 31%. The 1.4 is the percentage that Chris Dudley lost the 2010 gubernatorial election. Okay, so Chris Dudley came within 1.4 points of beating Governor Kitzhaber in the 2010 gubernatorial election. In 2010, the Oregon House of Representatives was split 30-30. And in 2010, about 31% of Oregonians thought that the state was headed in the right direction. So that's an election where voters were in a negative mood. I'll give some context for that 31% in a second. And that Republicans were able to split the House, and that the Republican candidate for governor came within a whisker of winning. In fact, he had the lead on election night, and it was the next day where sort of Multnomah County votes came in that put Kitts over the top. So when I think about 2022, I think that's a pretty good place to sort of compare to. Is this electorate more favorable or less favorable, and what are the dynamics relative to how they were in 2010? So first, when we think about the gubernatorial election and think about whether or not Oregon is a blue state or how much of a blue state is it, the Oregon gubernatorial election is just different. So if we go back to 2002, the last couple of decades, Democrats have won the attorney general races by an average of 24 percentage points. They've won the U.S. Senate races by an average of 14 percentage points, the presidential races by 12, state treasurer by 10, secretary of state by 7, a little narrower. But they've only won the gubernatorial elections by 5. And I think that there's reasons for that. Nationalization of politics means that sort of how people think about the Senate or the president might be different. In one attorney general race, the Republicans didn't even put anybody on the ballot. Then, of course, our gubernatorial races are on a different cycle. They're on a midterm cycle. But it's also, I think, that the Oregon voters think of the governor's race as just different than some of the others. They're not as dominant, Democratic dominant, as they are in some of these other races. So the margins for the gubernatorial races have been relatively narrow. In fact, the Democrats have only gotten 51, the max they've gotten in any of these gubernatorial races since 2002 is 51 percentage points. They've sort of been in that narrow band of 49 to 51. They haven't been able to break out. They've been fairly close. Now, one of the questions that pollsters love to ask is, all things considered, is the United States or Oregon or Clackamas County, are things heading in the right direction, or are they off on the wrong track? So these are numbers from DHM research going back to 1997. What I did is went through my entire archive and found every survey where we asked this question about Oregon and calculated the average for every year. Okay, so it's 230 plus surveys over this period of time. And we can really see how we are feeling today compared to other moments in the past. And if you just kind of go from left to right, you can see in 1998, 61% of Oregonians thought that we were headed in the right direction. That stayed at about that 60% level until 2001. And then it fell, right? We had September 11th. The economy was in tough shape. We were marching towards war. Oregonians felt different about that than maybe the country as a whole. Weren't feeling very good. Oregonians weren't feeling that great about President Bush. There's lots of reasons, but then we fell down to an average of 25 percentage points. Then we marched up to 45 by the mid-aughts. The Great Recession happens, we fall back down again. And here is what I'd sort of call out that 2010, so that 31% that I talked about earlier. We marched up again to 49%, and then we've been falling a little bit, and then we fell off a cliff from in 2021. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why, but now we're on average across all the surveys I've done this year, just 24 percentage points. In fact, I've had a survey as low as 18 percentage points recently. So Oregonians are not just in a sort of bad mood or a relatively bad mood, they're in the worst mood that they've been in at least the last 25 years. Okay, that is part of the environment. Now we'll talk a little bit about Portland, and so just how maybe some communities compare, and I'll say the numbers in Clackamas County aren't great either. They're better than this, but voters in Clackamas County aren't feeling all that great either. So what are the issues that voters are really focused on? So there's different ways to try to get at this, but I like this particular one. This is from a survey we just conducted in February. So you may have seen it in the news. We did this work together with OPB, and so they've been reporting it out as well. But it's just an open-ended question. You know, people could say anything that they wanted, but we asked, what is the most important problem facing Oregon today? We listen to everything they have to say. We put it into some categories so they're meaningful, and then we hear them reporting it out. And it's really pretty clear. First, before we even talk about what the individual issues are, I want you to know as you're interpreting this, when we ask a question like this in surveys, an open-ended question, what's the most important issue? Anything that gets above 20% is a real flashing yellow light that, boy, voters are really focused on that. Because they could say anything. They could talk about education or transportation or healthcare or the environment, all sorts of issues that voters care about. So if more than 1 out of 5 are signaling out a particular issue, that's important. Well, here we got 2. Homelessness, 29%. Mentioned homelessness, and we'll sort of talk about local stuff here in a moment, but statewide, 29% say homelessness. Number 2 is government and leadership, and I will say most of those, the vast majority of those sorts of comments are specifically directed at Governor Kate Brown. There'll be some about the Republicans and walkouts, but if most of it right now in the spring of 2022, most of them are about Governor Kate Brown. Public safety and crime is the next one down, and then politics and partisanship. And that is more like, I would just wish those folks would work together. They don't seem to be able to get things done. I'd like them to compromise more, whatever it might be, things around that. They're less personal in nature. But if we combine politics and partisanship and government leadership, you know, you're at what, 37%? of people are just feeling like the state's not working at a political level. And if we combine those, that would be number one. So it's really homelessness, it's political leadership, and it's crime. And then I'll ask you rhetorically right now, what don't you see on this list? Because I think whenever you ask a question like this, it's important to pay attention to what jumps out, what are people saying, but also maybe what are they not saying or saying infrequently. And the things that I would call out, number one would be education. Historically, when we ask a question like this, education is a number one or number two issue. I would say healthcare is not something that I see on this list. Climate change isn't something that I see on this list. I mean, those are three issues that somewhat partisan dependent, and we'll get to that in a second, but are often issues that voters are saying they're concerned about, or certainly politicians are talking about, but they don't come top of mind right now for voters. I also notice jobs in the economy is only at 6%. That's pretty low. Now, if we look back in time, so if we go back to that 2010 election, and a similar sort of question, what's the most important issue? In 2010, voters said jobs, government spending and taxes, jobs, government spending and taxes. So 2010, remember, that's the Tea Party year. That's really what people were focused on in 2010. In 2016, so we'll focus on the last two gubernatorial elections. In 2016, it was jobs, education, and taxes. In 2018, the last gubernatorial election, it was education, healthcare, and taxes. So if you think of the last, or three of the last four gubernatorial elections, kind of bread and butter, sort of typical issues, kind of like, things that you would historically expect that voters would care about. The issue set today is just different. Like I said, it's homelessness, it's government leadership, and it's crime. And I'd say that those are three issues that today really favor Republicans, especially government leadership, especially crime. Homelessness is a little bit of a mixed bag, but the way homelessness is framed and talked about can certainly be beneficial politically towards Republicans. So not only are voters in a bad mood, relatively speaking, the things that they care about right now are just different than the past, and probably, or say definitely, more favorable towards Republicans.
Hey, John, can I jump in real quick? There is a question. Is homelessness the first priority issue in many other states, or is Oregon somewhat unique among the other 50 states?
It certainly is a high, so the states that I work in tend to be on the West Coast. So I'll tell you, certainly it's a high issue in Washington State, no doubt about it. I couldn't say California as a state, but certainly communities within California, especially in the Bay Area, high levels of issue. Now I'll say in Oregon in particular, it is not just a Portland issue, obviously it's not as number one as a state, but like Portland, Salem, Eugene, Bend, Medford, all those sorts of communities along the coast, those coastal communities are also going to give a high level mention to homelessness as well. So definitely not unique to Oregon, certainly a West Coast issue. I couldn't say in other parts of the country because I'm not doing work there, and definitely not just a Portland issue. Now, just to talk a little bit about the specific, those top issues, in that OPV survey that I mentioned, we asked about crime and homelessness and whether they are increasing or decreasing in their communities over the last year. And the dark blue is in your community, the lighter blue is across the state, but 77% of Oregonians say that crime is increasing in their community the last year. 85% of Oregonians say that crime is increasing across the state. And then on homelessness, 89% think that crime or homelessness is increasing in their community, and 93% think that's increasing in their state. Now, but 43% of Oregonians live in the Portland metro area. So when we look at that homelessness number, for example, and increasing in your community, that means there's lots of folks outside the Portland metro area. Again, Bend, Medford, the coast, Pendleton, right, that are saying that homelessness is increasing in their communities as well. So definitely validates what we're hearing, right? So people say open-ended that homelessness is an issue, and here they're telling us, boy, it's getting worse in their communities and across the state. Now, with regards to political leadership, there's all sorts of ways we could look at it and think about it, but I think that these numbers are pretty telling. So we frequently ask, do you have a positive or a negative impression of, Kate Brown or Donald Trump or Ron Wyden or, Nike or Les Schwab, all sorts of different things. Just to sort of keep a track of how people are feeling about key people, key institutions, businesses in the state of Oregon. These are trend line numbers for Governor Brown and former President Donald Trump. They start both about 2015, 2016, and these are the positive responses. These are the positive impressions of the two. And I mean, it's pretty clear, right? I mean, Kate Brown has gone from, you know, for the first number of years in office, she was just hanging right around 50%, and then has just fallen and fallen and fallen steadily to where last month she was just at 20, or excuse me, in February, she was just at 27% of Oregonians in the positive impression of her. Now in Oregon, blue state, voted for Hillary Clinton, then voted for Joe Biden, has no great love for Donald Trump in Oregon, except his numbers are now a whole lot better than Governor Brown's are. Since we did a survey for OPB, another national polling shop called Morning Consult, they do statewide polling about governors on a regular basis, and they have numbers for every single governor in every single state in the country. And their numbers that they released last week had Governor Brown as the lowest rated governor in the country. So Democrats, Republicans, she was at the bottom of everybody. They asked the question a little bit different. Their numbers are a little bit different, but the story is the same. Governor Brown is an unpopular governor, and compared to other governors across the country, particularly unpopular. So political leadership, number two issue, and we can see that our Governor Brown is viewed quite negatively in the state right now. Now, with regards to some of the issues, in this OPB survey, we just gave people this list. And it's important that we give them this list and not some other list, right? There could be other issues that we asked about. But among this list, we said, you know, do you think that these problems are very serious in Oregon today? Somewhat serious, not too serious, or not a serious problem in the state? And here we get that validation again. What's that number one? And by a lot, it's homelessness, right? Homelessness was mentioned as a very serious problem in Oregon by 82% of voters. Violent crime, number two, at 68%. Drug addiction, number three, at 66%. Then forest fires, cost of living at 61. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So a high issue. We're going to see how that's changed over time in just a second. Then political leadership. And I just sort of kind of note at what is not rated as a very relatively serious problem compared to some others. Racial inequality, income inequality, climate change is fairly far down the list. Voter fraud at 41%, but hold on to that. But again, I think we're seeing like the pattern here. What are voters super concerned about and they care about? It's homelessness, it's crime, it's political leadership, there's cost of living issues. It's that set. Now, if we look by party and look at the top three issues in that scale I asked before, percentage of Democrats, Republicans, and non-affiliated voters who say that they're very serious problems. The top three problems for Democrats are homelessness, forest fires, and climate change. More environmentally minded. And concerned about homelessness, Democrats tend to live in urban areas. That's their issue set. Look at Republicans. Violent crime, illegal immigration, and voter fraud were the top three issues identified as very serious problems in Oregon by Republicans. And you see that by how some of the candidates are campaigning, what they're talking about. They're talking about crime with very visual images. They're talking a fair amount about illegal immigration. You may or may not think that that's a state issue, but Republican voters do. And that's a top concern for them. And voter fraud. And I've done some polling specifically with Republican primary voters for private clients. I can't be specific, but I'll say this is consistent across multiple surveys. The Republicans in Oregon are very concerned about voter fraud. And then among non-affiliated voters, it's homelessness, violent crime, and drug addiction. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but again, if you look over at Democrats and sort of the issues that they're focused on, just are very different from what voters who aren't Democrats are focused on. You know, Democrats represent about 35% of registered voters in Oregon. So, you know, it's a big group, but it's not the majority.
Hey, John, has voter fraud ever been a top three issue in Oregon?
No, it's certainly a post-2020 issue. In fact, we polled on, there's different ways to think about voter fraud. People are talking about it, thinking about it in different ways too. I definitely think that Democrats and Republicans are talking past each other a lot about the issue. What we have asked more about in the past is about mail-in voting. Up until 2020, and still a majority of Oregonians would say that they're supportive of mail-in, majority of Republican voters would say that they're supportive of our mail-in voting system, but that number has dropped. Historically, Oregonians have been super supportive of our vote-in-mail system, including Republicans. Automatic voter registration is a little bit softer support among Republicans, very high among Democrats, but voter fraud is really a post-2020 issue. Now, one of the big things, of course, that's happened this last week is this leaked memo about Roe v. Wade and the possibility or likelihood that it will be overturned. And I will admit, the DHM has not done a lot of polling on abortion over the years. In part, it just hasn't been central to Oregon's politics, and therefore we haven't had many clients ask us about it. And in our own surveys, we just have prioritized other issues. But I did ask about abortion in a statewide survey in January, and it was about a whole bunch of issues. And we asked whether or not that would be very important, somewhat important, not too important, and not all important to how they vote in the gubernatorial election. So the position that the candidates took on abortion or crime or drug addiction, whatever it might be, just is that going to be an important issue or not? Now, 67% of Oregon voters said that it was going to be a very somewhat issue for them when they're making the choice for who to vote for governor. And that sounds like a big number, and it's not a small number. But if you look on the right, you can see the difference. I'd kind of call out party, right? Democrats more than Republicans or non-affiliated voters. Also, college grads quite a bit more than high school folks. There is definitely an education component on abortion. But when we followed up, or I should say, in the context of all the things we asked about, abortion was the very bottom issue of importance. And then we followed up again, which I'll show you with this list. You can see here on the left here are all the issues we asked about. And we asked the voters, which one of those is the single most important issue when you're going to be voting for governor? And you can see, at least among this list, that abortion was at the bottom. So the gray here statewide, just 2% of voters said that was going to be the number one issue for them. But even among Democrats, it was just 1%. It was a little bit higher among Republicans. I mean, it's a small group of Republicans, but a little bit higher among Republicans. And you can see the number for non-affiliated voters there too. Now, this is January, right? This memo hadn't been leaked. There was expectation among people who follow Supreme Court politics that this decision was likely, but I don't think voters were paying attention to it in January. So these numbers could be different today. They could be different today, but at least in January, abortion just wasn't a key issue for voters. They were really focused on other things. I don't know what comes next. It could be that this issue ebbs again. It could be that it becomes central to campaigns over the next several months. I don't know. But if it does become central to campaigns, it's going to have to knock off a lot of other issues that voters have been telling us that they care about. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about Portland. Here's the reason why. You could go to really any, particularly the Republicans, but I'll talk about Tina Kotek in a second, any of the Republican websites right now, and just find some comments about Portland. Here's just one from Stan Pulliam. I'm not picking on Stan Pulliam. I'm just went to his website and found it in a second. But Stan Pulliam said, the culture of criminality that our state has allowed to fester in Oregon's big cities must come to an end. My first step as governor is to clean up our streets. My first step as governor to clean up our streets will be to triple the size of Oregon State Police and temporarily deploy them and the Oregon National Guard to end the endless violence in the streets of Portland. So a Republican candidate making Portland the issue. Here is Christine Drazen, again, just from her campaign website. Violent crime in Oregon is out of control, especially in Portland, which is experiencing an all-time high in murders. When police are being attacked, Kate Brown and Portland politicians ignored it. Under my administration, the days of treating police like criminals and criminals like victims will end. And then here's Tina Kotek. It's not from her campaign website, but it's something that she said to the media the other day. I'm not happy with Mayor Wheeler's performance. I worked specifically to say, here's money for an RV park. Where is it yet? When I said you need $2 million to clean up graffiti and trash at Oates property, it was there. I don't believe the city is focused in a way that they should. So you even see Democratic politicians, Tina Kotek specifically, you could find equivalent sort of comments from Tobias Reed, attacking, making Portland a focus of their campaign, understanding the frustrations that voters have. Here's just another data point to prove this. This is from a survey we did in September, so it's of last year, so it's a little old. But we just asked Oregonians, do you have a positive or negative impression of Portland? Just 45%, that's that green, had a positive impression of Portland. 50% had a negative impression of Portland. We also asked about Oregon's rural communities, and you can see the difference in red and green. And if you want to get a sense, like we also asked in the survey about the pharmaceutical industry. And you can see that Portland has the worst reputation, or at least equally bad reputation, among Oregon voters as the pharmaceutical industry. Not a historically, traditionally well approved of entity here in the state. Why do I also think that Portland matters in this election? A part of it is because Portlanders don't feel good about Portland. So here is just the positive impressions of Portland by area of the state and by party, but I'd focus on area of the state at the top. Just 53% of those in the Portland metro area, 53%, just a bare majority of the people who live in this area have a positive impression of Portland, okay? And then on that classic right direction, wrong track number, these are surveys, again, in DHM's archives. I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of them where we've asked about whether people think the city's heading in the right direction or wrong track. Right now in Oregon in 2022, across all the surveys we've done, just an average of 8% of Portlanders think that the city's heading in the right direction. And again, I draw our attention to 2010. In 2010, when Dudley came within 1.4 points, and when the Oregon House of Representatives split 30-30, 57% of Portlanders had a positive, or thought that the city was heading in the right direction. It's going to be more difficult than any time in the last 20 years for a Democrat to run up the score in Portland or in Multnomah County. Whether turnout might be suppressed, whether you have more voters looking at Betsy Johnson, whether you have some Democrats who, or non-affiliated voters who maybe typically would vote for the Democrat, consider the Republican. It will be harder for Democrats to run up the score in the most Democratic part of the state because the voters here are upset. And they also think that Portland is an election issue. They're also concerned about homelessness. They're also concerned about crime. They're also concerned about political leadership. Again, this is why I really think that this environment is to look compared to 2020, or excuse me, yeah, to 2010, and look for some data points. Is it a better environment? Is it a worse environment? And this is definitely a signal that if you're a Democrat, it's a worse environment. All right, a little bit about the economy. This is from Gallup. Gallup asked the question, what's the most important problem facing the country? And they've been doing it for a long, long time. This is their chart of the percentage of Americans who say that economic issues are the most important problem facing the country. And right now, at the end of the chart here, 39% of Americans, given the chance to say anything that they want, mention economic issues. That is up a lot from just a few months ago, when it was just 9% of Americans said that economic issues were the most important problem. I do think that what matters to voters' behavior is change, right? The change meaning going from 9% to 39% means a lot. Because if we look historically, 39% isn't that unusual. I mean, there's been ups and downs, but that's not a lot or a little. It's kind of like about average or the median. But when you have, millions of Americans changing their opinion about what the biggest issue is, that's what matters, right? That's what's making economic issues more central. And really, it's inflation, it's cost of living. It's not jobs like it has been in the past. It's cost of living and inflation. That's what's driving that number. And again, when you have a big change like that, that's the signal that voters are going to care more than necessarily the absolute number. And if you just look at, they have an economic confidence index. This just goes back to the pandemic, but this is April 2022, so it's last month. This is April 2020. That's when everything was shutting down at the early days of the pandemic. Economic confidence by their scale is lower now than it was 2 years ago when everything was crashing and the economy was going into lockdown. Okay. Gives you a real sense of how people are feeling out there. All right. If we were face to face and having some conversation, I would ask this question rhetorically and we would have a little sort of convo about it. But I just ask you maybe to yourself, how would you rate Oregon's economic conditions? Because we did ask Oregonians how they would do it. So this is from February. We gave Oregonians a question. How would you rate the economic conditions of the state? Are they excellent, good? Are they poor or very poor? 65%, nearly 2/3, said that they were poor or very poor. Okay. Now it's pretty well distributed across the state, more in rural Oregon than the metro area, a little bit higher among older folks and younger folks, a little bit higher among less education. But of course, this is become a partisan issue. This is kind of new. It's not new in the last 4, 5, 6 years, but if I go back 10 years, certainly before that, when you ask Oregonians or Americans about economic issues, Democrats and Republicans tended to view them the same way. Now it's become very partisan. It does make this question a little bit more difficult to interpret, but I'd say broadly, Oregonians aren't very happy about the economy. And I'd say that's despite the fact that unemployment is super low. There are tons of jobs available, right? It's the cost of living. And we can really see that with this chart. So we frequently ask in our surveys, how are you feeling about your personal finances? Not the state as a whole, not the country, but you personally. How you doing? Are you not at all worried about your personal finances? Are you not too worried? That's the green. Are you somewhat worried or are you very worried? Well, in February, 55%, a majority of Oregonians said that they were very or somewhat worried. Now that number, just a little context, that's quite a bit lower than it was during the height of the Great Recession, when about 70% of Oregonians were saying that they're very or somewhat worried. It's up a little bit from this, from about a year ago. This time last year, just about 48, 49% of Oregonians said that they were worried. So that number has been moving upwards again. But I think what's really important, both electorally and just sort of understand what's happening in the community, is what's happening by age. So in April 2021, so a year ago, more or less, if we look by the youngest cohort, our 18 to 29-year-olds, in April 2021, 62% said that they were very somewhat worried. That's fallen among that group to 46%. But among our oldest cohort, are those Oregonians who are 65 plus, in April 2021, just 28% said that they were very or somewhat worried about their personal finances. Now it's 56%, right? The older voters on fixed incomes, retirees, they are more affected, more worried about inflation. And they experienced inflation in their past work, and they can probably make some determinations about how it's going to impact them in ways maybe younger people can't. But who's the most likely to show up to vote? Who are candidates going to be talking to and catering to? It's those who are 65 plus, and they've become a lot more worried about their finances this last year. Okay, just a bit about taxes. I do think that Oregonians are going to be more tax averse in 2022 than they have been in the past, although that's probably relatively speaking. If we do ask Oregonians, are different groups paying too much or too little in taxes? We still see majorities say that large corporations and upper income people are paying too little in taxes. Now, this is down. About a year ago, 2 years ago, these numbers would be closer to the 70s. About 70% of Oregonians would say that corporations or upper income people are paying too little in taxes. So that's moved a little bit lower, but still majorities are saying that. Lower income people, 22% think that they're paying too little. You personally, just 4, and small businesses, just 3% of Oregonians say that small businesses are paying too little. I didn't include it in this particular survey, but in other surveys, I've also included middle income people. Oregonians tend to think that lower income people pay too little in taxes. More Oregonians will typically say that lower income people pay too little in taxes than middle income people. We could talk about sort of the reasons why, but that's true. And you can kind of see it here too. Just 22% think that lower income people pay too little taxes, just 3% of small businesses. And then just a few election numbers just to keep in mind, and then I'll turn it over for Q&A. One is just party registration. We have a primary. Our primaries are for our partisan elections are closed. And so it's just good to keep track of what percent are registered as Democrats and Republicans. But you can see the blue line, the Democrats are falling. The red line also Republicans falling. And then the yellow line, non-affiliated and third party, those are vast majority are non-affiliated. That number's on the rise. Motor voter 2016, that made a difference for sure. But note that the number of non-affiliated voters have been increasing for a long time. So motor voter accelerated this trend, but it did not cause this trend. And if you want to talk about that in Q&A, we certainly can. But right now, just what is it, 58% of voters are registered as a Democrat Republican, and that's who can vote in our partisan elections. If you think about turnout, so this goes back all the way to 1966. This is for midterm primary elections. Again, all Republicans, blue Democrats, yellow non-affiliated, third party. Turnout among Democrats has been right around 45, 50%. Excuse me, for Republicans. Turnout for Democrats has could have been at 40 to 45% number. Turnout among non-affiliated voters has been falling. We could sort of talk about the reasons why. It's a little complicated. But turnout for these midterm primary elections is not great. Oregon has good turnout relative to other states, but turnout in our primaries is pretty mediocre. Turnout so far, this is very early. This is a lot of sort of numbers to look at, but this is the dark yellow is turnout as of today in Oregon compared to the average turnout in midterm elections from 2002 to 2018. So basically, how is this election comparing to recent elections? Right now, turnout's 4%. The average on this day in the cycle is 7%. This number will increase, but if you look at the previous days, it's very early, but turnout does look to be trending a little below average so far. There are a lot of candidates on the ballot. That could be a reason. We can mail in our ballots to election day, right? Now that postmarks count, that could be a reason. It could be that folks just aren't energized about what's happening out there either. We'll see what happens, but I'd say right now, as of today, turnout looks not great. Not great. Typically, again, on average, it's only been 39%. We have 1 billion candidates running for governor, and this sort of ties into my point about turnout. But here, just going back to 1982, the number of Democrat, blue, Republican gubernatorial candidates we've had, we got 34 candidates. And that doesn't include Betsy Johnson or third-party candidates that might be running. This is just D's and R's. We got 34 candidates. There are 19 Republicans. The reason I call this out is that, one, that could be recent turnout slow. Voters have a lot of people to be thinking about, learning about, and they're just not ready to cast their ballots yet. The other is it could take very few votes to win, particularly among the Republicans. And let me just walk you through some numbers. So let's start. I'm going to focus on the bottom because I think that's more interesting. There are roughly 700,000 Republicans. It's a little bit more than that, but that makes math a little bit easier. So turnout, we'll say, is about 50%. Well, now we're, what is that, 350,000 voters, give or take. So 700,000 to start with, turnout at 50%, you're about 350,000 voters. Turnout, it might only take 25 to 35% to win. In fact, it could take 20% to win, wouldn't surprise me. But if you just kind of run the numbers, you can see it may only take 90,000 votes for the Republican candidate to win the nomination. It may even be fewer. if turnout's lower and, something less than 20% wins. Which is to say, if you are endorsing or supporting a candidate with your time or your money or your, Twitter feed, this is a time where you really could have an impact, right? It doesn't take that many votes to potentially move to be consequential. Now, on the Democratic side, there are 15 candidates, but there's really two. It's Tobias Reed and it's Tina Kotek. We'll see. Maybe one of them get over 50%. But if you kind of do some numbers, kind of doing the same math, there's more Democrats than there are Republicans. But you can see still, it might not take that many votes to win. This is a consequence of declining percentage of the voters who are registered with a party. A low turnout and lots of candidates means that you could win with very few votes. It's a pretty remarkable in that sense. And that's it. I'm gonna pause there. I'm happy to entertain questions as long as you'll have me.
I could listen to you all day, John. So thank you. That was great. Since their party, I'm assuming questions are coming in.
Yeah, sure.
Since the party has been in control at City Hall, who do registered D-Portlanders believe is responsible for the city's woes compared to the unaffiliated and ours?
Well, I'm not sure. Should I leave this up? Sure. I'm not sure if I should leave the presentation up. I'll take it off for now. I can put it back up if we need to. Well, there's very few Republicans in Portland, so I forget what the number is, but I think it's around 10%, 8%, something like that. So Republicans in Portland are going to vote anybody who is in office, for sure. If we look at sort of approval ratings of the individual members of City Council, they're all bad. I can't be specific because some of it's private polling that I've done, but 70, 80% of Portlanders don't have a positive impression or disapprove of the job performance of the City Council. I'd say that's particularly so with Mayor Wheeler and particularly so with Commissioner Hardesty. Dan Ryan, Mingus Maps, Carmen Rubio, they're different people with different policies. So but also they're not well known. The two most prominent and identified people in council are Mayor Wheeler and Commissioner Hardesty, and voters strongly disapprove of them. It is higher among Republicans since we have them, higher among non-affiliated voters, at least with Wheeler. Maybe relatively a little bit better with Democrats, among Commissioner Hardesty, but pretty well disapproved by everybody.
That actually, I will unapologetically ask about the Hardesty race. I don't know if you can even share, have you done any more recent polling? Because I think the last poll that came out was the end of March.
Well, I'll just sort of say in general that we have done some polling, but I can't speak specific about it. This is a difficult environment for incumbents, no doubt about it. I'd say that particularly difficult for Commissioner Hardesty, because she's more well known. She's more well known specifically on an issue that voters disagree with her on, with how she's managed crime and her positions around homelessness. I'm not a policy person. People make their own judgments, but just telling you where voters are at on those issues. The other thing is that she's being challenged by two candidates who I think are just closer to the median voter in Portland right now, Vadim Mazursky and Renee Gonzalez. That's a three-way race. I think there's a decent chance, maybe even a good chance, that she gets in the top two, because I think those two candidates are splitting voters from each other. Now, Commissioner Ryan doesn't test well. And if you ask, do you plan to vote Commissioner Ryan for somebody else, or don't know? I mean, certainly don't know up until recently, or somebody else is leading. But ultimately, elections are not a referendum. They're a choice between candidates. And I don't believe that voters are attracted to the positions that A.J. McCurry is putting out there right now. She's much further to the left of Portland voters, given the issue set that they're concerned about. So I think Dan Ryan's in a good position to win, even a good position to win in the primary. Commissioner Hardesty is in a very challenged position and may not get out of the primary. But because it's divided, it's definitely possible that she will.
I know that the Renee and Vadim battle is unfortunate. Further on Portland politics, do D-voting Portlanders believe the city's problems are because of these specific leaders in charge, or do they think at all it's the D platform that they are implementing that needs to change?
That's difficult to say exactly. If you ask them if they feel like the city council, I forget exactly how we asked it in our most recent public survey, but essentially, do you have confidence the city council's, working towards solutions for the city? That's not the wording, but that's the gist of what we're trying to measure. And 80% said no, right? So there's definitely a sense that city council isn't working. They're not supporting policies that they feel are being successful. Whether it's because of democratic positions, I'm fairly doubtful of that. I would say that we've seen a shift in sort of a question like this. Would you like to see police funding increase or decrease or stay about the same? Portlanders are very much in the camp of increased police funding, right? There's a core set of voters, maybe it's 20, maybe it's 25%, that would like to see police funding decrease, and they're loud and they're organized, and that matters. And again, I'm not the policy guy, I'm the public opinion guy. But that's not where the majority of voters are at. And then a question like, do you think homelessness is mostly caused by a lack of housing affordability, or caused mostly by mental health and drug addiction? There's been a change there. 3, 4, or 5 years ago, Portlanders would consistently, not everybody, but a good healthy majority would say it's mostly a problem of housing affordability. Now it's very much divided. In fact, it's probably even leans a little bit more towards it's mostly drug addiction and mental health. And it does tell you the shift that we're seeing. And I think people are responding to what they're experiencing in their communities, what they're seeing on the streets, what they're seeing working or not working. Whether those are Democratic or Republican positions, other people can sort of define for themselves. But I do think there's a shift in attitude around those two key issues in Portland.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit to the governor's race,
Mm-hmm.
You definitely touched on how many candidates there are, and it's wild. But with Betsy Johnson running in as an independent, and
Mm-hmm.
definitely very unprecedented these days, seeing the rise in independent registration, do you see that giving her a little bit of a bump to potentially win overall?
So first, let's start from, I'll try to answer some.
That's a lot, sorry.
So one, I don't think we can read much into the rise in non-affiliated voters as being helpful for Betsy Johnson. It may be, but I think people are not affiliating with Democrats and Republicans for a whole set of reasons. Some of it is they just don't like the parties. Some of it's just mechanics, right? The way we're doing registration in the state is pushing people towards non-affiliated because that's just how automatic voter registration works. But that's a condition that's out there. I would say that given the environment, that the fact that Oregonians are more upset about the direction of the state now than any time in DHM's polling, right? That would say that voters maybe would look towards something different. Absolutely. One of the things that I've sort of observed in my conversations with maybe not political insiders, but at least politically engaged and informed people who might know who a senator from Clatsop County is, right? They are very attracted or think that voters might be attracted to Betsy Johnson. And when they say that, I think they specifically mean Betsy Johnson. And I just would tell you, voters have no idea who Betsy Johnson is. They have no idea who Betsy Johnson is. Now, they're going to get to know her. She's got a ton of money to spend. And I think what we're going to see, particularly after May 17th, and I'm guessing, I don't really know, but I'm guessing we're going to see a good amount of spending by Betsy Johnson because it's going to be incumbent on her to define herself to voters in the ways that she wants to be understood before Democrats and Republicans do that definition for her. And so what we're going to see from Democrats is we'll be trying to describe her as an anti-environment candidate who is in the pockets of big business and Oregon's wealthiest individuals. Like that's where her campaign financing is coming from. She's, natural resource extraction worries Democrats, like they're going to try to define her that way. Republicans, I'm sure, will define her as a career Democratic politician who voted with Kate Brown and Tina Kotek up 10% of the time, and trying to make her look like a Democrat who's just really not that different. And who can sort of win that race? Can Betsy Johnson win that race by getting out there fastest and defining herself, or can Democrats, Republicans win those races and defining her before she can? I don't know. But I think that's sort of what's the next few months are gonna be about.
So we'll all get our popcorn and just
yeah.
Yep, that's pretty much. Another question: as the nation swings right, Oregon traditionally swings further left. I mean, that's what our state has done over the years. If Oregon is potentially swinging more moderate, which is kind of what you've been insinuating, what are your predictions for the nation? Is the nation, I know that's like looking into the tea leaves, but.
Well, the sort of big picture, I mean, I think like most folks are making the same calculus, which is in midterm elections, the president's party struggles, and I fully expect that to be the case here. So, with the Democrats having the trifecta in DC, and Americans not happy with the direction of the country, particularly upset about the rising cost of living. Joe Biden's approval numbers not good. I fully expect Republicans to do well in Congress. I would expect the Republicans to take both, certainly the House and very likely the Senate. That would be my expectation at this point. Whether they're becoming more conservative or whether they're reacting against frustrations about the current conditions of the country, I think that's harder to tease out, to be honest. Another thing is, I don't, like, this is not to be flip, I don't even know what conservative means anymore. Like, I'm struggling, and somewhat liberal too, but there's certainly, I think Republicans will do well, and then therefore Republicans will have power in DC.
It's a very good point. Yeah. Yes. Can we talk about the Kurt Schrader race for Congress?
Sure.
And just, obviously districts have changed, so that's that.
Yeah, I mean, Kurt Schrader, his districts are changed. He's a person who's skilled and experienced and successful in competitive races. And I think that there's times when I say Democrats, like party activists, sort of like involved Democrats, really scratch their head. What he's doing, I think, sort of his not wanting to vote, maybe didn't vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House, is the infrastructure sort of foot dragging that he did, and he would say he got good things out of it. I mean, people can argue that, but I just would look at the guy's success. He seems to know how to win in tough districts, particularly in the parts of Oregon he represents, and I think that says a lot. The Jamie McLeod Skinner is a formidable Democratic candidate. As that group of Democrats becomes smaller and smaller, down to 35% of the statewide overall, that means the people who are still Democrats are more partisan than they used to be, right? So those kind of less partisan sort of people are now not affiliated, right? So what's left is a harder core Democratic voter, and we see that with her getting the endorsements of some of the county parties. I have not seen polling on that Democratic race. I don't know. My guess is that Schrader wins, and then it's a very competitive general election. And I don't have a good feel for Jimmy Crumpacker versus Lori Chavez DeRemer, who wins that. But regardless of who does, I think that is at best a toss-up race, and I probably would, if I were to rate things, I probably would say lean Republican at this point, just given the national environment.
Right. I was surprised that, to earn Joe Biden's endorsement, it was definitely interesting for Kurt to get that. With that, can we slip into the 6th district now that Oregon has a new 6th congressional district, and we've got a ton of crypto money coming in for Carrick, and then we've got former state rep Andrea.
Yeah. So just big picture, if you just look at party registration, I'd expect that to be a Democratic seat. Sort of a swingy one where a Republican could win it from time to time, but sort of like on paper looks like a Democratic race. I think that assumes an incumbent, and we don't have an incumbent, and this is a difficult year for Democrats. And so it depends on who wins that primary. I think it's close. It wouldn't surprise me if a Republican's competitive. I think Ron Noble is a good fit for that district on the Republican side, and that's who I would anticipate winning that primary. That it's very conceivable to me. I'd say it leans probably Democrat, but it's certainly conceivable to me Republican wins that seat. And the reason I say that is, I just said the Republican is maybe even I'd say leans Republican, the 5th district, maybe a toss up in the 6th. Well, let's just play this out. If Republicans win the 5th and Republicans win the 6th, Vance is going to hold that seat, obviously, in East Oregon. That would be a 3-3 split for Oregon, which would be pretty remarkable. I'm pretty sure we're not there yet, but I'm pretty sure Democrats hold on to that 4th district because it's just been drawn in a way that's very favorable to Democrats. It would be hard. It's harder for Alex Skarlatos to win that race than it was 2 years ago, even in this environment. But a 3-3 split, I think, is possible. Of course, has been a Democratic state, so it ends up being 5-1. You'll say Horvick said it could be 3-3, and you'll be like, of course it was 5-1 because it's Oregon. But I think the environment is pretty good for Republicans in those districts and quite challenging, especially the 5th for Democrats.
Yeah.
And then who wins the primary in the 6th? The latest polling I've seen looks like it's a 2-person race between Salinas and Carrick. That feels right. It does feel like that the momentum might be towards Salinas at this point, although there's so much money being spent. I'm hesitant to speculate, but it does seem to be between those two.
Yeah, the Willamette Week article, they came out and said that Carrick has knocked on like 500 doors, probably less. So it's very interesting. I was like, man, $8.6 million and 500 doors.
But there's a group out there, and I can't remember the name, that has spent something like $800,000, $1 million on voter outreach as an independent expenditure. So someone's knocking on doors or handing out flyers. It's just not him.
Not him. Yeah. So getting more Clackamas County specific, I realize we only have 3 minutes left, but there was a question about House District 40 specifically. I know Mark Meek is now running against Senator Kennemer for the Senate, obviously, but the question was about House District 40 specifically. So I don't know.
Oh, you're going to challenge my knowledge there.
That's Oregon City area.
I know the district. I just haven't looked at it closely enough to be able to have an informed, knowledgeable opinion. So I wish I did. I don't know.
No, I know. I wanted to ask the question, but this was all very, very helpful and very informative. So thank you so very much. And thank you to all those of you that tuned in. I don't know if you have any closing comments you'd like to make.
only to say that I'm happy to make this presentation available. I'll email it to Nellie. And so if anybody's interested, you can certainly have it. And then I'm available if anybody wants to give me a shout, questions afterwards. You can be filled or email me, give me a holler on the Twitters. I'll do my best to answer.
All right, John. Well, thank you so very much. We very much appreciate your time and all your hard research. And we'll get the popcorn and tune in maybe right before the general election. So.
All right. Well, may all your candidates win.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Cheers.